Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. In this video I want to talk to you about the one thing that brings all of our projects together. It's the woodworking joinery. Now what is woodworking joinery? It is the method of joining two pieces of wood together to create a more complex item. Now in some cases joining two pieces of wood together is done with fasteners such as screws or nails. In other cases it's done with adhesive such as wood glue. And in most cases it's done with the actual wood itself, and that's what we're going to talk about in this video. I've asked a couple of friends to help me explain some of the common woodworking joints that you may use in your shop. So what are some benefits of using wood joints? Well, in most cases it's the strength. A lot of times various woodworking joints provide more structural strength than using fasteners or adhesive. In other cases is the appearance. A lot of times different joints provide a different aesthetic look to your project. As well as flexibility. There are a range of different types of joinery methods out there that will allow you to perform different tasks and build different projects. Now in this video we're going to talk about 4 common joints that you may use in your projects. The first one is the half-lap joint, also known as the lap joint. The second one is the Mortise Tenon. The third one is the miter joint. And the fourth one is one of my favorites, the box joint, also known as the finger joint. Let's get started with the half-lap joint.
For those of you who don't know, my name is Jay, this is my shop, and I want to show you a very simple, very easy, and very strong woodworking joint. The half-lap joint. I've used half-lap joints to make anything from these simple contemporary picture frames all the way up to this complete half-lap blanket chest. And because half-lap joints are incredibly strong, I made my entire table saw station out of nothing but half-lap joints. So what is a half-lap joint? When you have two pieces that are the same thickness and you remove half the material on each piece, you can connect them like so or overlap them to create a half-lap joint. Now why it is so strong is because you have a lot of long grain to long grain glue surface. That bond creates a very, very strong joint. Another great factor about this joint is the fact that you have this shoulder and this shoulder glued in to prevent any type of racking, which is this type of movement. To make perfect half laps on the ends of your workpieces, you need to make sure that you have two things set up properly. First is the blade height. You need to be half the thickness of your material. This may take a couple times of adjusting to get it perfect. You also need to make sure that you have a stop block set at the width of your material coming from this side of the blade if your stop block is on the other side. So this will allow me to travel the exact width of my material. You can create a perfect half lap on the ends of your pieces just by using a simple stop block. But what if you want a half lap somewhere in the middle of your pieces? That's where this little jig comes into play. This is a homemade kerf maker. And what it is with this side perfectly flush, I have a distance right here that is equal to the kerf on my particular saw blade. And what we can do is adjust this to the material we are working with, tighten it down, and as you can see that's pretty tight. Now, with our measured piece right here, we are given a distance traveled right here, which is the perfect amount we need to move our workpiece to create a perfect half lap. Now I've got a stop block set up over here with my kerf maker next to it, and as you can see I've got two particular stop locations for my workpiece. And I can make my first cut here, rotate my kerf maker, and then finish out the cut like so. I made the same series of cuts on both of my pieces, and as you can see, our first test fit is perfect every time. So whether you're looking to join two pieces somewhere in the middle or simply on end, consider the half-lap joint. It's very strong, it's very quick, and it's very easy. If you'd like to make one of these DIY kerf makers, click in the description for a link showing you a video of a step-by-step process on how you can very easily make one of these. You know, I've made a couple of these, and I've used them in several projects since I've made them. Why don't you go ahead and make one yourself, and I guarantee you'll be glad you did.
Now as Jay just demonstrated, the half-lap joint is a very strong structural joint, and there's a lot of uses for that particular joining method. Now our next joinery method is the Mortise Tenon. And here's Brian to tell you a little bit more about that.
Probably one of the most common and strongest joints in woodworking is the Mortise Tenon joint, and I'm going to show you how I make mine. When making a Mortise Tenon joint, you have a few options when you go to make your mortise. You could use a benchtop mortiser if you had one, or you could use a handheld router with a spiral bit, or you could just take it over to your drill press and use a drill bit to hog out most of the material and then just clean it up with a chisel afterwards. For this example, I'm going to be using my handheld router with a spiral bit. So the board that I'm using in this example to join to this other piece of scrap is 3.5 inches wide. And I decided to go with a 2-inch wide tenon. So that means I'm going to have 3/4 inch shoulders on each side of the tenon. And then I need to make the corresponding 2-inch long mortise in this board. So now that I have my 3/4 inch boundary at the top and my 2-inch long tenon, I can go ahead and scribe a line down the center of this board to mark the location for the mortise. So by using a handheld router with an edge guide, I can go ahead and hog out this material for this mortise. I set the depth stop on my router to a 3/4 inch deep mortise. It's not really a good idea to remove all the material in one pass. I took deeper and deeper cuts with each successive pass until I got all the way down to my depth of 3/4 inch. So now that I have the mortise cut, it's time to turn my attention to the tenon. And by the way, I always like to cut my mortises before my tenons because it's easier to fit a tenon to a mortise than the other way around. So the first thing I'm going to do is make my shoulder cuts on the top and bottom of my stock. So now with the blade raised, I can go ahead and make the shoulder cuts on the top and bottom of the stock. So the cheek cuts on the top and bottom of the tenon, I'm going to cut out at the bandsaw. But if you didn't have a bandsaw, you could easily do this with a handsaw. So with my stock clamped to my homemade tenoning jig, which rides up against my table saw fence, I can cut the cheeks off each side of the tenon. And it's not a bad idea to practice this on a piece of scrap wood first to get the fit right before you turn to your actual stock. When fine-tuning the fit of a tenon, nothing comes in more handy than a dial indicator next to your table saw fence. Real easy to make micro adjustments this way. Because we made our mortise with a router bit, we're left with round corners. But our tenon has square corners, so what we need to do is square off these corners with a chisel, and that's real easy to do. Alright, so let's see how we do with our fit. Not too bad. A little bit of clamping pressure and this would go right home. Alright, so a little bit of glue on this joint and this joint will last for generations.
Now, as Brian also just demonstrated, the Mortise Tenon joint is a very strong structural joint as well as a very aesthetic joint. There's a lot of different things that you can do with that, such as through Mortise and tenons, to create a visual effect for your projects. Now, another common woodworking joint that you may use in your shop is the miter joint. Here's Steve to tell you about that.
I'm going to show you 4 different methods for creating 45-degree miter joints, which are commonly used in boxes and in picture frames. If you're on a really limited budget or have very little space to work in, get yourself one of these miter boxes. You can get these plastic ones real inexpensively. Sometimes they even come with a saw. And all it is just a little jig that has different slots in it at different angles. I've got mine mounted to a board so I can clamp it to my workbench to hold it steady. And then grab the board that I want to cut a miter in and line it up wherever I want that cut to be. And I like to clamp it into place. Then you just drop your saw into the slots and start cutting. And there's your 2 miters. But if you don't want to wear yourself out using a handsaw, you could step up to a miter saw. A miter saw lets you make cuts at all different angles and will lock in place at 45 degrees. Line your board up against the fence and pull the blade down. And that's a lot quicker and easier than using a handsaw. Now, of course, if you have a table saw, you could use the miter gauge that came with the saw. You'll probably want to screw on an additional fence to it so that your workpiece has more support. as you make the cut. There can be a little bit of play back and forth in the runner that could cause your cuts to be slightly off. But the best way to get dead accurate 45-degree miter cuts every time is to build yourself a dedicated miter sled for your table saw. These two fences are at exact 90 degrees to each other, so the key to using this sled is to cut one board on this fence and then the piece that matches up to it cut against this fence. And once you got all of your pieces cut, it's just a simple matter of gluing them together. These band clamps really make it easy to glue up frames. And after the glue dries for an hour or so, you can remove it from the clamp and you've got your frame. They're not the strongest joint in the world. You probably wouldn't want to use them for anything that's going to take a lot of stress to it, but for decorative items, they work out great.
Now, as Steve just showed, the miter joint is a very quick and easy joint to make, and it's very functional for a lot of your projects. He also demonstrated that it's not a very strong structural joint, so there's certain limitations to where you would use that particular joinery method. Now, our last joinery method is the box joint, more commonly known as the finger joint, and they can be demonstrated by taking your fingers and interlocking them at 90 degrees. Kind of represents what they look like, hence the name. Now, when it comes to finger joints, which I'll refer to them as that in the rest of this video, they are a very strong structural joint, as well as a very aesthetic joint, enhancing the look of your project. And they're a great alternative to dovetail joints, which we're not going to cover in this video. Now, one of the more common ways to make finger joints is on your table saw using a jig such as this, a finger joint jig. But finger joints can be made on your router table as well as hand cut. But for me, a more efficient way is to use a jig. Now, in the rest of this video, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about finger joints. So let's get started. When it comes to making finger joints on the table saw, you only need a couple of things. You need a dado stack to determine the width of your cut, as well as either a miter gauge or a finger joint jig. Now, your miter gauge can be used to cut finger joints by simply installing it into your saw, attaching a piece of wood to it, and creating a quick and simple finger joint jig using it. A more efficient way is to use a finger joint jig. And this particular finger joint jig rides in both miter tracks of the saw, creating an efficient method for making these joints. When it comes to making the finger joints, you want to determine how wide you want the spacing between each fingers. For this example, I'm using a 3/8 of an inch dado stack as well as a 3/8 inch key on my jig to make 3/8 of an inch fingers. One of the more common projects for using the finger joinery method is box making, which is why finger joints is also known as box joints. Now, not only are finger joints a strong structural joint, but in most cases they can be an aesthetic joint as well. In this example, we're going to be using finger joints to join the four sides of this mahogany box. But imagine if you were using contrasting woods, such as mahogany and maple. The finger joints add an aesthetic appeal by allowing the contrasting colors to interlock with one another, creating a visual effect for your project. No matter what jig you use to make your finger joints, the first thing to do is to get your dado stack set up. In this example, I have a 3/8 inch dado stack in my table saw because I want the fingers of my project to be spaced at 3/8 of an inch apart. The next step is to slide the jig up to the blade, because when I set my blade height, I need to account for the base of the jig. I take my piece, set it on top of my base, and then I can adjust the height of my blade accordingly. When it comes to setting the height of the blade, I like the blade to be just a bit higher than the workpiece itself. That way the fingers protrude a little bit when it's joined together, and I can sand them flush after everything is glued up. Once the blade height is set, the next thing we want to do is make sure we're using the appropriate key. Now, for this jig, the keys are interchangeable. I can go from 1/4 of an inch to 3/4 of an inch, depending on the spacing I require for my project. Now, the key's thickness corresponds with the thickness of your dado stack. 3/8 of an inch dado stack, 3/8 of an inch key, 3/8 of an inch spacing between our fingers. What the key is used for is after each cut, our workpiece can lock on to that key, ensuring that our next cut is properly placed. The next step in this setup is to ensure that the space between the key and the blade equals the same amount as our blade and our key. We're using a 3/8 of an inch dado stack. We've got a 3/8 inch key, so this space should be 3/8 of an inch. And this allows for proper spacing of our fingers. Alright, well that concludes the setup. We've got our 3/8 of an inch dado stack in the table saw, and our blade height is set. Make sure when you're setting that blade height that you account for the base of your jig. We've got our proper key in there, 3/8 of an inch, and the spacing between the key and the blade are set at 3/8 of an inch. So we're ready to go to cut our 3/8 of an inch fingers. Now, when it comes to actually cutting the work pieces, we're going to cut 2 sides at a time. Now, there are some jigs out there that allow you to cut all 4 pieces at one time. However, this is not one of those jigs. When it comes to setting up for the cuts, I like to place my pieces in the orientation I want them. From there, I number each piece. Number 1 with an arrow pointing in that direction. To number 2 with an arrow pointing to this piece. Number 3 with an arrow pointing to this piece. So on and so forth. So that way it keeps me orientated as to which direction everything is going. From there, we're going to cut 2 pieces at a time. So what I like to do is take my 2 pieces and fold one into the other. And that way I can start my cuts. Once these 2 pieces are done, I come back to here, make sure everything is in line. I grab the next 2 pieces and cut those 2 together. And I repeat this process all the way around till all sides of my box are cut. When placing my parts on the jig, the back piece will fit up snugly against my key. The front piece will be offset off of the key by 3/8 of an inch, which is equal to my finger spacing. Once I have the front piece properly offset, for the first cut I like to use a clamp to hold everything in place. Now I'm ready to make my first cut. Once the first cut is made, I no longer need the clamp. What I want to do now is take my back piece and hook it over the key. My front piece will now then butt up against the key, keeping that 3/8 of an inch offset at all times. From there, we can go ahead and make our second cut, and then repeat the process, sliding the piece over and interlocking it with the key for each cut. Now, if everything was set correctly, our 2 pieces should interlock nicely and our joints should be nice and tight with no gaps or anything in between. And we should have a little bit of an overhang on each side of the fingers that can be sanded flush after the glue up. Now, bringing the 2 pieces that I just cut back over to my other pieces, making sure that my numbers and arrows are orientated in the proper direction, I can now take this side piece and this front piece that we just cut the other side on and fold them together and bring them over to my jig and get everything set up to make that cut. And I'll repeat that process for all 4 sides. Alright guys, well it's just that easy to make box joints on a table saw, and as I said, they are a very strong structural joint and they'll add some aesthetics to your box or your project. All I have to do now that all 4 sides are cut is to go ahead and add some glue, get them in clamps, and I'm ready to go. Alright guys, well if you're interested in learning how to make this box joint jig, I'll have the video out in just a day or 2, and you'll be able to find the link to that video down in the description, as well as on my Facebook page and everything like that. As far as the rest of the joints that you saw in this video, also down in the description you'll be able to find the links to those how-to videos to make those jigs. I would like to thank Jay, Brian, and Steve for helping me make this video. And hopefully between the 4 of us, you can take something from this video and use it in your shop. Well, until next time, guys, happy woodworking. See you soon.